whichever type of buyer you happen to be, what I know to be true is that all types of property buyers have one thing in common. Whatever they buy, and for whatever reason they buy, they want it to be in an area that's going to show some growth. They want it to grow in value. Even if it's a house they plan to buy and live in for the rest of their lives. It's really nice if your major assets grow in value. So right now, we're in a situation where we have a lot of changes happening in Australian real estate, and we've got a very aberrant media reporting real estate in a very strange and negative way, putting out all sorts of erroneous messages. And what I know to be true from the research that we do every day at Hotspotting is that there are some really strong growth markets around Australia right now. In fact, locations where prices are falling are very much in the minority in this country. Most locations have rising prices, or at least prices that are holding their own. And amid all the research that we do, we're trying to identify the next growth markets. We want to be able to tell people where prices are going to grow before they take off. Not much point in telling people where prices grew 20% last year, which is what media does a lot. And what we've discovered recently from our research is that the statement that's headlined on the screen here, that Canberra is Australia's strongest real estate economy, I believe that to be fundamentally true. And I'm going to show you in the next 20 or 30 minutes why we believe that's the case. Obviously a lot of change happening in property markets around Australia. Most of our media comes out of Sydney. They're very obsessed with themselves, and they've kind of turned what's happening in Sydney into a national crisis. But we know that what they're telling us about Australian property prices falling simply isn't true. We simply got changing circumstances, and what we're trying to do and what we're trying to help property buyers do is identify where the new growth markets are. And we've developed a bit of a catchphrase out of that, which is think small for big growth. And by that we mean that the growth markets that we see emerging right now in Australia are the smaller capital cities and some of the regional centres. So it's no longer about the big cities. So think small for big growth. The problem is what I call, the words down the bottom of the screen there, the great seething mass of media misinformation. That's the big problem at the moment. Most of our major media comes out of Sydney. They kind of think that what's happening in Sydney is happening across the country. They generalise, so the capital city average is dragged down by the problems in Sydney, so we get this negative figure which media purports to describe the whole of Australia. Property prices are falling everywhere, so we're getting headlines like this: Australian house prices fall for the 14th month in a row, and house prices falling at the fastest pace since the GFC. What that means is that, according to some research sources, not all of them, the average for the capital cities is this negative figure. And it's mainly because of what's happening in Sydney. It's not so much Melbourne. Most of the capital cities still have pricing that's growing a little, or in some cases, like Hobart right now, quite a lot. And then all of regional Australia is completely forgotten, doesn't exist. And that's where some of the strongest markets are right now. So the headlines that we're seeing every day, and because of the research exercise we do, we're seeing everything that's been written, and it's just this great sea of negativity, and it's scaring a lot of people, and it doesn't need to be happening because there's plenty of growth to be found in real estate in Australia right now, and Canberra is one of those places where we think growth is going to be happening in the next few years. Australian Bureau of Statistics divides Australia into 88 sub-regions to gather information of all sorts, not just real estate stuff, and some figures that came from CoreLogic recently found that half of those sub-regions right now have real estate prices which are growing. Then there are others where prices aren't growing, but they're not falling either. They're just sort of holding their own. So locations where prices are actually falling are very much in the minority, and the strongest growth markets coming out of that, and again, the smaller cities and some of the regional centres. Another one of the problems is that media tends to report figures from certain sources as fact. You'll see an article that says Melbourne house prices dropped 9% last week. Well, actually, did they? According to CoreLogic, they did, but Australian Bureau of Statistics says Melbourne prices are only down 2%. Realestate.com.au, which is the biggest real estate website in the country, they deserve to be listened to. They say also 2%. So who's right? And if you look at the figures for all the different cities, there's an enormous difference. Look at Darwin. CoreLogic says their prices are starting to rise again, 2%. But Domain says they're still down 9%. Who the hell do you believe? I mean, it's incredibly confusing, particularly the way media reports real estate price data. What I want you to understand is that it's all rubbery figures. It's all dodgy data to a certain degree. Think about what they're trying to do. No, take Sydney. 700 plus suburbs in the Greater Sydney area. And they're as diverse as Bondi Beach versus Penrith or Manly versus Campbelltown. And what they do is they dump all the sales in those diverse areas into a big melting pot and they spit out one figure and said, this is what's happening with Sydney prices. But you get all these different answers when they do that because they've all got different methodologies. They reckon Sydney's down 5%, and they reckon 6%, and they reckon 11%. Who's right? And it's just creating masses of misinformation and confusion. But basically, none of those figures actually tell you anything that's useful. I mean, Canberra, most of the figures for Canberra are in the positive from all the different sources, but it doesn't really tell you anything useful about what's happening in Canberra because when you do what we do at hotspotting, when we do it suburb by suburb, town by town, then we start to find out where the growth is really happening because even within a relatively small city like Canberra, there's all these different things happening. You've got suburbs that are up 20% in the last 12 months, some up 10%, some up 5%. Couldn't find very many where prices had fallen, in fact. But I'll speak about that a little bit later. But all this stuff that's in the media all the time, incredibly unhelpful, very misleading, and downright wrong most of the time. And whenever I get asked by people, what are your 10 rules for successful property investment? I say, okay, here we go. Rule 1, stop reading newspapers. And they all kind of titter a bit because they think I'm joking, but I'm not, I'm really serious. Just stop reading them. All you're doing is filling your heads with negativity and misinformation. Much better ways to get informed about everything, but particularly about real estate. The reporting of real estate in this country is just appallingly bad, particularly right now. So I get asked a lot of questions by property investors and other buyers. For example, I do a live Q&A on Facebook regularly, and the question I get asked a lot is it a good time to buy? And what I say to people is, that's the wrong question. The right question, or better question, is where is it a good time to buy? Because in this really big country, Australia, with all these different markets, all this diversity, it's always a good time to buy somewhere. There's always somewhere in Australia that's a growth market waiting to burst forth and show price growth. We don't ever have a situation where all markets are doing the same thing. So, you know, some of the questions that are more intelligent, how come Sydney rose so strongly but Brisbane didn't boom, neither did Adelaide? Perth, how come Perth was going backwards while Sydney was going forward so strongly, and Melbourne as well? And Canberra, while Perth was slumping and Darwin was in the toilet, Canberra was steady and chugging along nicely. How come all these differences? And the answer is there is no such thing as the Australian property market, even though media is talking about it every day. What's happening with Australian property prices? Economists do that. They generalise and treat it as one market, but we don't have one market. We have lots of different markets, literally thousands of them. And they're all dictated by local conditions. It's all about the underlying economy. It's not about the record low interest rates. It's not about the Banking Royal Commission. It's about what's happening in this local area, in that economy. Is the population rising? Is the economy strong? Are jobs being created? Are they spending on infrastructure? Those are the things that matter. And that explains, once you understand that, you start to understand why we've got all these different markets, why Sydney boomed but Brisbane didn't, why Perth slumped but Canberra remained steady, and all sorts of other variations of those themes. I saw an item on ABC TV a few weeks ago saying, yeah, Canberra's doing all right, but inevitably it's going to slump because Sydney has, and it'll just follow Sydney. But no, Sydney doesn't lead Canberra. Canberra doesn't follow Sydney. Never has. Canberra's doing its own thing. It's got its own story happening. And just to prove that, I went back to the start of the century and looked at what happened year by year with prices in Sydney, and then put alongside it what happened with Canberra. And there were no years in which they were doing the same thing. After the last big boom at the turn of the century, Sydney prices dropped quite a bit, similar to what's happening now. There was a correction after the boom back then, but Canberra didn't go down. It stayed up moderately. Then 2006, 2007, while Sydney was kind of steady, Canberra was rising strongly. And so you go through all those different time periods. While Sydney was booming 10, 15, 20% a year, Canberra was just chugging along moderately. Sydney started to trend down in 2017, but Canberra was up quite strongly. And last year, while Sydney was down a lot, generally speaking, Canberra was still very steady. So, you know, two cities very close together. A lot of people assume that one will influence the other, but no, it doesn't work that way. And the reason is that Canberra's got its own story, it's got its own economy, and as I'm about to show you, it's a really strong one. It's the strongest real estate economy in Australia, and I want to demonstrate to you. This is the question that a lot of people are now asking, because a lot of people have invested in Sydney and Melbourne, but they understand that value is no longer rising. Where next? And Canberra, I think, is one of the answers to that question. Where next to go for good growth? And in summary, the reasons for that, Canberra right now, the ACT, number one in the nation for population growth, the third strongest economy according to ComSec, with their State of the States report, highest average incomes, the lowest unemployment consistently, very low vacancies, number one for rental growth, forecast to have the highest price growth over the next 3 years by a number of different credible sources, and very strong long-term growth, as I'll illustrate in a moment. So the numbers start to stack up very strongly for Canberra and the ACT. There's nowhere else I can find that's got so many positive numbers. All the important things that are important, the underlying economy, wages, unemployment, population, all of those things. There's nowhere as strong as Canberra for that right now in capital city Australia. So those are the latest population growth figures out of the ABS. For a long time Victoria's led and Canberra's been second, but the ACT's now joint number one on the latest figures, well above the national average. That's a very important figure for this part of the world. It's underpinning a lot of what's happening, because there's a bit of a construction boom going on in the city, and it's projected to keep on going for the next several years. And that population growth, that consistently strong population growth, is one of the things that's really underpinning that. ComSec puts out its State of the States report every quarter, and the most recent one published in January had the ACT as number third in the national rankings. There have been times when the ACT's been number two. It's sort of always somewhere between number two and number three, but what they said is that ACT's now number three, but closing the gap on the two big states, Victoria and New South Wales. In some areas that feed into that equation that they use, the ACT is ranked number one in the country, housing finance, dwelling starts, and in their ranking it's number two on population. They've got a different sort of formula that they use to arrive at their rankings, but it means that the ACT consistently ranks higher than big state economies like Queensland and Western Australia, South Australia and all the rest, except Victoria and New South Wales. But they're closing the gap according to the latest report. Unemployment's also very important in real estate, and consistently the ACT is by far the lowest in the land. Look at Queensland, 6.1%. It's a bit of a growth state, has that reputation. No one ever talks about Canberra and the ACT as a growth state the way they talk about Queensland as a growth state, and yet the numbers for the ACT are way stronger than Queensland or Western Australia and all those other places. Vacancy rates, I don't know how many people in the room are renting at the moment, but if you are, you probably realise that it's pretty competitive out there. Rents are high in this town, and it's anything that's advertised for rent, there'll be, you can just about have an open house and there'll be queues of people. And that's why Canberra vacancy rates have been below 1% for quite a long time. Only Hobart, according to these figures, which are from SQM Research, has slightly low vacancy rates. But look at Sydney. Sydney's now 3.2%, Canberra's 0.9%, well below average. And out of that's coming the strongest rental growth amongst any capital city in Australia. These figures here are like the city average according to SQM Research. in the last 12 months, on average, across the capital cities, house rents dropped a little bit and unit rents sort of stayed pretty much the same. But Canberra's sort of up 5% for houses and 5.5% for units. And look at the comparison with Sydney. Rents are falling in Sydney, but they're rising at a very healthy rate in Canberra, and that's been the case for a couple of years. It's actually a market to look for. I know a Melbourne-based firm that I have quite a bit to do with, they do lots of innovative research to pinpoint which cities are going to go next. And they were in Sydney in 2012, 2013, before the boom started. And one of the markers that really attracted them was that for the previous couple of years, Sydney rents had risen quite a lot, but prices hadn't moved much. And that for them was a big marker that prices were going to do something. And they were right. So that's one that we look for as well. We've had strong rental growth in Canberra for a couple of years. Prices have been solid but not taking off yet. That marker suggests something's going to happen in Canberra, along with a few other ones. Interesting to look at the long-term growth rates. These figures were published just in the last week or so by CoreLogic. How much of property value has grown on average over the last 20 years? The national average, 197%. Darwin's the worst of the capital cities because their market's been going backwards for 5 years. Sydney's done okay, but Canberra's done better, according to those figures. I mean, like I said, to a certain degree, they're all rubbery figures, but it's interesting, isn't it? Most people would think that Sydney would be way out in front of everywhere because it's had this big boom, but for the previous 10 years, Sydney did really nothing. Its market was just flat. But Canberra has just been chugging along the way Canberra always does. I often refer to Canberra real estate as the Goldilocks of real estate. Not too hot, not too cold, just right. That's Canberra. It's always chugging along nicely, and sometimes it's doing better than that. Whereas markets like Sydney, they have a boom and then there's this correction. We don't see that happening in Canberra. And that's a valuable commodity. I mean, what do you value as a person who owns real estate? The first thing you want is safety. You want to know that we own real estate. It's not going to dive in value at some point. Nice, safe, solid markets. Canberra's got that more than any other place in Australia, I believe. It's just so solid, so dependable, so safe. And then on top of that, with all the markets it's got right now, it's got potential to actually be better than safe. It's got potential to be a really strong growth market. The current price figures, you know, some of them say Canberra house prices are up on average, generalised figures, 3%, 4%. But when we did it suburb by suburb, sort of down the bottom there, we found 27 suburbs that have grown sort of 1% to 5% in their median prices in the last 12 months, then 31 suburbs that have grown 5% or more, of which 13 suburbs have grown 10% or more. So you've got all these differences, but mostly growth. We could only find 5 or 6 places where the median prices had dropped a little. And then you've got these ones I highlight in the middle of the screen there, where the markets are up 20%, 30%. You know, not sure I always believe those figures because sometimes median price data can be misleading, particularly if the sales sample is small. But you know, you've got to look behind those generalised figures and find out what's really going on. And when you do that, you see that there's plenty of markets excelling in Canberra right now. But it's not being reported anywhere as a growth market. It should be. But it just flies under the radar screen with media. It doesn't deserve a mention. It's all about the big cities. And so the really strong positive story that Canberra's got to tell is going unnoticed at the moment. So we publish this thing called the Price Predict Index every quarter, and we go through, as I mentioned, every town and suburb in Australia, looking at sales volumes, because what we're looking for is where's demand rising. If the sales activity quarter by quarter is rising, that means demand is rising and prices are going to follow, usually with a time lag. Now, we've been doing it for 4 years every quarter, and the latest one we've done, and we just did it last week, is that Canberra right now is stronger than it's been any time in the last 4 years since we started doing this research. There's more suburbs with growing demand around Canberra than ever before. And that's supported by the fact that the norm in Canberra is a suburb that's grown by at least 5% in price in the last 12 months, in contrast to what's happening in Sydney down the road. And so we say it's undoubtedly one of the steadiest markets in the nation. In fact, we believe it's the strongest real estate economy in Australia. Master Builders notes that Canberra's had record-breaking construction boom recently, about $1.5 billion worth last year. It's going to be the same this year, and they're forecasting for the next 3 years. All that building is happening for a reason. It's underpinned by this strong population growth, underpinned by this really strong economy that I've spoken about. It's pretty good, strong. It's really strong for a city when that's happening, because construction creates a lot of jobs, and it creates a lot of economic activity, and it just feeds throughout the whole economy. Another forecast for Canberra came from Moody's Analytics recently. In the last couple of weeks they put out a report where they're predicting that Canberra's going to lead on price growth for the next year or so. I think prices will rise about 6% this year. What I know to be true is those sorts of predictions are very conservative. They always err on the side of caution. If they're predicting 6%, the outcome's probably going to be a little bit more. It usually is, but it's just one of several reports that have predicted very solid growth for Canberra prices over the next little while. So yeah, just to wrap up, bear in mind when you're considering real estate purchase of any type and you're absorbing media sound bites and headlines and it's all pretty negative, just keep in mind we don't have one market with many different markets driven by local economic events. There are lots of strong markets across Australia, and Canberra is very much one of them. It's expected to be a growth leader for the next 2 years or 3 years and beyond, according to various credible forecasters, of which we are one. And again, I repeat it, I'll say it one more time, Canberra's got Australia's strongest real estate economy, and I hope I've convinced you of that.